Chapter 42 of The Barnabys in America by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 42. Another pleasant family repast. The Major practices his part before his wife and child. They are enchanted. The happy family concert measures for the future. The Major performs his part before company with the most brilliant success. There certainly are some people who, either from fortune or temper, or the influence of both united, seem to swim down the stream of life more gaily than others. Such persons, it is true, will often keep their colours flying long after fainter spirits would strike, which may often, perhaps, give them the appearance of being more triumphant than they really are. But if this be sometimes delusive, at any rate it has often the effect of imposing upon the parties themselves, and may perhaps, not unfrequently, produce that mad sort of luxury which, as the poet tells us, none but madmen know. Considering the nature of the adventures through which the Barnaby race has passed since their arrival in the United States of America, and the species of catastrophe with which nearly every adventure had concluded, they could scarcely have enjoyed themselves so vehemently as they certainly did at the Franklin Hotel upon Lake Erie, had not their spirits been excited by some portion of the sort of laughing gas above alluded to. The supper at the Washington had been delightfully full of fun, frolic, triumphant glee, and the dinner at the Franklin was, if possible, more brilliant still. Nobody, unless it had been Asmodeus himself, could have looked upon the group there assembled, and have doubted their being in the possession of some especial cause for rejoicing and merriment. The harmony that reigned among them seemed as perfect as the contentment, and in short, a merrier party could not easily have been found. Patty, indeed, was a little in the dark as to the nature of the scrape from which her pap had just escaped, but this only added to the jocularity of the rest, as she never alluded to the cleverness of her mamma, in managing so beautifully to prevent her papa's being hanged, without eliciting a most cordial burst of laughter from the Major and his lady, and a charming simper of answering applause from her Don. But time wore away, and as the hours rolled on towards 9 o'clock, Major Allen Barnaby hinted, with an amiable apology to the family group, for marring their mirth by drawing their attention to business, that it would be necessary, or at least prudent, to decide upon where they were to go, and what they were to do next before going on board. As he said this very gravely, the effect of it was rather to increase than mar their mirth, for Patty laughed immoderately, and declared that when Pap put on a preaching face, in addition to his preaching garments, the fun was just perfect. Whereupon the Major, in order to prove his unabated good humour, and the reality of his reluctance to substitute business for fun, stood up, and placing the back of his chair before him to represent the front of a pulpit, he began, amidst shouts of applause from Patty and her mamma, to show them how he intended to preach. After devoting a few minutes, however, to this capital joke, he resumed his seat, and renewed his request that the subject of their next campaign might be taken into consideration. "Where, for instance," he asked, "where are you to be, all of you, while I am performing the part of a travelling minister at Sandusky?" "Where?" repeated Patty. "Where should we be, my darling papa, but close to you, and hearing you preach, to be sure?" "This would be the pleasantest scheme for me, my dear Patty, there can be no doubt of that," replied the Major, "but I question whether it would be the safest." "Because of the danger of my laughing, pa? Is that what you mean?" "If it is, you are just a goose for your pains," said his daughter, "for as I told you before, you shan't come to be hanged if I can help it, and I'll be bound for it that if you give us a fair trial, mamma will be quite as likely to start off laughing when you begin to preach as I should." "Thank you, my dear Patty, for caring so much about my safety," replied her father, politely kissing her hand. "But I am afraid, Patty, that it is not your laughing, or your mother's either, that will constitute the danger of our being together." "I fancy not, indeed," cried Mrs. Allen Barnaby eagerly. "What can you be thinking of, child, to talk such nonsense? A pretty way it will be for him to remain unknown, to have you and I and Tornorino following him about." "Alas!" rejoined the Major tenderly, "no man wishing to escape observation must travel with such handsome faces." "And that's true, Mr. Pap, I don't deny it," said the young beauty with a well-pleased smile. "But what will you do with us then? Must we set off without you, as we did when we went to the Springs?" "Exactly so, Madame Tornorino," said Mrs. Allen Barnaby with decision. "Indeed, I'm afraid that so it must be," quoth the Major. "But it will only be necessary to make the separation long enough to ensure my being pretty generally known by sight at Sandusky as the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough. This will, you know, effectually prevent my being traced thither as Major Allen Barnaby, and it is to this device that I must trust for my security during my future wanderings through this comical country. Having thus thrown out my amiable friend Mr. Gabriel Monkton, I shall have no doubts or fears whatever about rejoining you, and the only question is, as to where this reunion, so greatly wished for by me, shall take place." "The first thing to consider in settling that point," said Mrs. Allen Barnaby, "is how we can, with the least danger of meeting any one whom we desire to avoid, draw gradually nearer and nearer to the coast; for I confess that, notwithstanding all the wonderful success we have met with, I shall be most excessively rejoiced to feel myself once more on the highway towards Europe. I don't care a straw about going back to England, but I certainly do long to be in Europe once more." "And in Europe once more, my dear, you most certainly shall be before you are a year older, provided, that is to say, that you do not get tired of my company, and elope in the interval with some such fascinating individuals as Mr. Gabriel Monkton, Mr. John Williams, Mr. Colonel Beauchamp, or Mr. Judge Johnson. As for myself, I honestly avow that I have had quite enough of— well, and what may you be called, and where do you calculate you are going, and what location did you fix in last? I won't deny that I am tired to death of it all. But I have no great fancy for England either, just at present at least. And so, if we are all agreed, I expect, as the darlings say, that our pleasantest plan will be to make for Havre de Grace, and from thence to Paris. Afterwards, perhaps we may vary the scene again, by visiting Baden-Baden, you know, Tornorino. There are 1,000 pleasant places we may go to, provided we can get off from these confounded States without having our wings clipped." "And that I will engage for your doing, without let or hindrance," said his wife, "if you don't get tired of preaching too soon, Donny. I got a good deal of information about the western country at the Springs, and that it was, I believe, which first put the notion of your turning preacher into my head. Miss Wigley, that was the name of my principal friend at the Springs, Miss Wigley told me that it was quite past belief how a tolerably good-looking man would be followed in any one of the western towns if he did but make noise enough. Now, I don't think anybody can deny, Major, that you are rather more than tolerably well-looking still, though I won't say you are quite as handsome as when I first saw you at Clifton. And as for making a noise, as she calls it, if you have but the will, I am sure you will find the way." "1,000 thanks for all your charming compliments, my dear," replied the Major. "Trust me, it shall not be from want of exertion that I will fail. But what else did you learn from your friend Miss Wigley? I think it will be quite as well not to make any particular inquiries here about the country beyond Sandusky. There is no occasion whatever that we should leave a plan of our route behind us. Did the lady mention any considerable towns westward?" "Oh, mercy, yes," returned his wife. "More than I can remember, a great deal. But I have a sort of general idea about the way we have got to go, and of the principal towns we must pass, in order to get round again to the sea. For that, you know, is what we must do before we can set off according to the Major's beautiful new plan." "Most certainly, my dear," he replied, "we must get round again, as you call it, to the sea. But there is more than that to be thought of. We have got to make up our minds as to which port will be most agreeable to us. I don't think I should particularly like either New York, Philadelphia, or New Orleans. However, there are many others to choose from, but we need not trouble ourselves about that now. Let us get fairly off to the Wild West, as some of them call it, and we can settle about the port to sail from afterwards." "To be sure we can," answered his wife, "and you may be sure of something else too, and that is, if you will go on, dressed as you are now, and let us call ourselves O'Donagough, we may go safe and sound anywhere. No living soul would ever find us out, particularly if we take care not to stay too long." "My gracious, how you talk, mamma!" cried Patty, staring at her. "Do you fancy that because Pap happened to fight a duel at New York, like an honourable brave gentleman as he is, that we are all to be hunted through the country as if we were wild beasts, with a pack of dogs at our heels?" The rest of the party exchanged looks upon hearing this very sensible question, and it seemed for a moment as if nobody chose to answer it. But at length Major Allen Barnaby replied, "Nothing can be more natural than your observation, my dear Patty. But the fact is, that the government of the United States is very remarkable upon this point. The horror in which they hold duelling is so great, that all the states have agreed together to punish with sudden and prompt vengeance any individual who has been guilty of it, let him have committed it where he may. However, I rest with entire confidence on the opinion of your mother, as to the safety ensured by the change of name and appearance, and I really think that once out of this part of the country, we may make our way to the coast by whatever course may eventually appear the most agreeable to us." "Well, then, that's all settled," cried my heroine gaily, "and there is only one more question to be asked before we make ourselves ready for starting. Where are we to perch ourselves, while the Reverend Major establishes his reputation as a preacher at Sandusky?" "Upon my word, my dear, it is a question that I think you must answer yourself; for, thanks to your Miss Wigley, it seems evident that you know more about that part of the country than I do," replied the Major. "Well, then," she replied with decision, "I vote for our pushing on to Pittsburgh at once, because I know that is one of the places at which we may conveniently decide whether we will go to New Orleans or not. It would be certainly by far the most convenient, for Miss Wigley told me it was all by water, and monstrous cheap, and the other way we should have to cross over some tiresome high mountains, which would cost double as much." "Good. That then will be the place and the time for deciding our port of embarkation. Yes, Pittsburgh shall be your quarters till I rejoin you," said the Major, "which will be, I should hope, in about 10 days or a fortnight." This ended the discussion, and till the steamboat was announced, the party amused themselves by imagining the vexation of Mr. Gabriel Monkton on arriving at Sandusky, and finding the bird he was in pursuit of flown. Had any doubts rested on the minds of Major and Mrs. Allen Barnaby as to the advantages likely to arise from the reassumption of the respectable attire which had been first adopted at Brighton, the very first specimen of their reception on board the boat would have removed them. Though the day had been bright and warm, the evening air on the lake was already cold and chilling, and my heroine and her daughter almost immediately descended to the ladies' cabin in search of warmth and shelter. Even before they moved from the gallery, however, the warmth-loving Tornorino had escaped to the smoky sanctuary of the gentlemen's saloon, so that when the ladies moved, Major Allen Barnaby, or rather Mr. O'Donagough, would have been left alone had he not moved with them. He therefore did so, watching with his usual attention the steps of his charming Patty, whose peculiar style of galloping movement on all occasions made the operation of descending cabin stairs somewhat dangerous. Ere she reached the door at the bottom, however, which, as it was open, displayed a considerable number of females within, she suddenly stopped, exclaiming, "Oh, goodness, papa! Get upstairs again as fast as you possibly can. Do you know we were told at the Springs that it was not at all safe for a gentleman to go into the ladies' cabin after it was the least bit dark, for that if they did they were very often soused over head and ears with water, and sometimes made wet to their skin before they could get away." This advice being given without any mitigation of the speaker's usually well-sustained voice, it reached the ears of 2 ladies who at that moment occupied the doorway, and the light of the ample lamp above it, darting its rays at the same moment full upon the comely shaven face, cropped grey hair, and sable suit of the Major, they were both instantly seized with a fit of compunction at the idea that so reverend-looking a gentleman should suppose it possible that, among American females, he should run any risk of being subjected to the discipline sometimes resorted to, in order to keep persons of a far different stamp in order. Full of praiseworthy feeling, the eldest of the 2 ladies exclaimed, "Oh my! Pray, miss, don't say that to the gentleman, as if what you describe was intended for such as him. It would be 20 times more likely, sir," she added, making the respectable looking gentleman a low curtsy, "ay, sir, 50 times more likely, I expect, that every female present should quit and be off to the deck to make place to a gentleman of your appearance, than do by you what the young lady mentions. But I calculate she is a stranger in these parts." Nothing could be better timed than this amiable and conciliating address, for it not only gave cheering evidence of the perfect success of Mrs. Allen Barnaby's happily imagined project, but most fortunately reminded the principal actor in it of his cue, which, to say truth, he had utterly forgotten, and had not the warning voice reached him at that identical moment, he would have replied to his daughter's speech in a manner which might have very nearly neutralized the effect of his appearance. As it was, however, all went well. The Major was far from being a slow man, and too much depended upon his own adroitness on the present occasion for him not to rally his powers in an instant, so as to perform the part his admirable wife had allotted him in a manner to do him, as well as herself, infinite honour. Great indeed would have been the shock to her nerves if he had not done so, for she was on the stair behind him, and her noble bosom heaved with anxiety as she awaited his reply to the words above recorded. But she had no cause to fear. His words were appropriate, but his manner was better still. "May you meet the reward you deserve, dear lady, for feelings which do you so much honour," he said. "I will not abuse this most exemplary feeling, but if it be shared, as I trust it is, by the amiable looking group I see behind you, I will enter amongst you with pleasure for a short interval, hoping that my presence may do more good than harm." The meekness of this reply was exceedingly touching, from the modesty, the humility, and gentleness of its tone, and it instantly received the reward it deserved; for no less than 6 females more, all of them young, and for the most part well looking, pressed forward to second the invitation of the first speaker. The only one, indeed, who was neither the one nor the other, was the only one also who did not appear to share the general enthusiasm. She kept herself very decidedly apart from the group that now pressed round the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough, very much after the manner of bees round honey, nor did she open her lips at all, till the stewardess came in to complete her arrangements for the night, and to her she certainly took the liberty of addressing a few observations, but not in a tone sufficiently loud to prevent the eager conversation still going on among the rest of the party from continuing as uninterruptedly as if she had not spoken at all. "I guess," said one pretty young lady about 17 years of age, "that so kind and pious a gentleman as you seem to be, sir, won't take it amiss if one of the sisters of the Needle Steeple congregation of Sandusky takes the liberty of asking your name?" "Instead of a liberty, my dearest young lady, I can only look upon it as a beautiful proof of a lovely Christian spirit, seeking fellowship and brotherhood with the godly," replied the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough. "Indeed, sir," responded the fair sister, "I calculated that you would just say that, or else I am sure I wouldn't have spoken for the world. Thanks to my pastors and masters, I know my duty better than to put in my oar out of place. And what is your name then, sir?" Our major was at this moment in imminent danger of exchanging a glance with his wife, so greatly amused was he at perceiving that, notwithstanding the decided evangelical tendency of his fair fellow passenger, the national catechism still evidently superseded all others in her thoughts. But luckily he remembered what he was about, and in such good time too, that the profane smile was perfectly well converted into everything he wished to make it, and he replied in the very best manner possible, "My name, my dear young lady, is O'Donagough. I am called the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough." "Oh my!" exclaimed the charming young creature in return. "I didn't for a single moment doubt your being the Reverend. That would have been a sin indeed that I should have had to confess at the next meeting of the sisters. In course, sir, you have heard tell of the Needle Steeple congregation of Sandusky? I believe our congregation is pretty well known by this time in most parts of the world." "It would be an ignorance of which I might justly be ashamed, my dear young lady, had I not heard of it. But I rejoice to say that it is long since I first became acquainted with the admirable society to which you allude. Not personally, indeed. That is a happiness to which I am still looking forward with all the eagerness of hope. But it is long since the Needle Steeple congregation of Sandusky has been known to me by the voice of fame." "My! Isn't it a pleasure and a reward, Mrs. Tompkins, to hear ourselves spoken of in this way by such a pious gentleman, from over the sea too, as 'tis plain enough he is by his way," said the young lady, clasping her hands thankfully. "I am sure, Miss Vanderpuff, I feel it to be so, from the very top of my head to the soles of my feet, and I am thankful for the privilege of conversing with the like. It may not be that impossible, sir," continued Mrs. Tompkins, addressing the major with a most engaging look of affectionate humility. "Indeed, I can't say that I see it should be at all improbable, but what you cross the water just on purpose to have a look at us. Our revivals are talked of far and near, that we all know for certainty, and our camp meetings have been taken as a pattern and example for miles and miles." "My dear ladies," replied the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough, pressing both his hands firmly upon his heart, and raising his eyes with great fervour to the ceiling of the cabin, "my dear ladies, it is difficult for me to express my feelings at this moment. This lucky chance, this happy, thrice happy accident, inspires me with a degree of joy and thankfulness that I have no language adequately to express. Your conjecture is perfectly correct, my excellent Mrs. Tompkins. I did indeed leave my native land for the express purpose of becoming personally acquainted with the Needle Steeple congregation of Sandusky, in the delightful hope that by the most indefatigable attention on my part to its principles, and all the precious regulations respecting it, I might be enabled to carry home with me to my own dear but comparatively benighted country such hints of holiness and morsels of mercy as might enable me to purify and enlighten my own beloved congregation, so as to make them become to Great Britain what the Needle Steeple congregation of Sandusky has become to the United States of America. Think then, dear ladies," he continued, "think what must be my feelings at finding myself thus in the very midst of those for whose sake I have toiled and tossed across the wide Atlantic." "It is indeed a most providential blessing, sir," said a third lady, coming forward and placing herself, with her hands crossed behind her, immediately opposite to him. "I am Mrs. General Pedmington of Mount Lebanon, and these two sisters of the congregation will be able, I expect, to give you very satisfactory reasons for thinking that if you indeed seek to make yourself acquainted with the Needle Steeple and its dependencies, you were pretty tolerably in the right path when you happened to fall in with me." "Oh my, I expect that you are indeed," exclaimed Miss Vanderpuff. "Isn't he, Mrs. Tompkins?" "Indeed, sir, and that's what you are," returned the lady thus appealed to. "Mrs. General Pedmington is the very tip-top of the congregation in all respects, and has sat in the front row of the anxious benches for these 2 years past. And it is she, sir, who gives up at Mount Lebanon, and a right down beautiful place it is too, the very largest and holiest of parties throughout the revivals. It is a privilege just to be present at one of them. I am sure no person of good judgment would ever wish to make one in a worldly-minded party afterwards." "A privilege, indeed," returned the major, with a deep-drawn sigh. "I know of none in any country that I should value so highly." "Then, in course, sir, you ought to be one of us, and such I hope you will be, Mr. O'Donagough. That, sir, I think is your name." Mr. O'Donagough bowed, and looked deeply grateful. "Well then, sir, when we reach our place of destination, I hope we shall become better acquainted. My residence, as these ladies have told you, is Mount Lebanon, and when you have fixed yourself at your boarding house or hotel, as the case may be, you shall be pleased to send me up your address, and I will take care that 1 or 2 of our ministers shall wait upon you, and then we will fix an evening for meeting the sisters and a few clerical individuals at my house." This open and decided patronage on the part of Mrs. General Pedmington induced the other professing ladies of the company to take courage, and come forward from behind the bed curtains, where they had concealed themselves on the entrance of the reverend gentleman. And 1 or 2 among them even ventured to put into his hand some little tracts, without which, as we all know, such ladies never travel, so that in the course of a few minutes the major found himself the centre of a circle which effectually hemmed him in, and rendered his withdrawing himself from the forbidden precincts where this scene took place a matter of very great difficulty. While all this interesting conversation was going on in one part of the little cabin, Mrs. Allen Barnaby and her fair daughter took refuge in another, and that at the farthest possible extremity from the scene of action. My heroine's motive for thus withdrawing herself was one which at every period of her life, and under all variety of circumstances, had ever maintained too strong and active a hold upon her mind to be ever entirely laid aside or forgotten. Personal comfort and the best accommodation for the coming night, which the actual state of things permitted, occupied her completely during the interval which the major was employing with so much energy in propitiating the favour of his new friends. But the circumstances in which Madame Tornorino found herself were totally different from those of either of her parents. At this time she had but one sole object in view, which was to conceal the irresistible fit of laughter which seized upon her on hearing her father make the various speeches recorded above. Under any other circumstances whatever, the unscrupulous Patty would have laughed out, without caring a single farthing whether pa and ma were angry or pleased. But the notion which she had got into her head that her father was in very considerable danger of being hanged, and certainly would be if discovered to be Major Allen Barnaby, instead of the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough, really terrified her greatly, and she never in her life had exerted herself so strenuously to overcome any feeling as she did now to check her ill-timed mirth. But it was all in vain. Totally unused to restraint of any kind, she was quite unable to control her rebellious muscles, and after a long and violent struggle, finally broke out into one of the most vociferous paroxysms of laughter that was ever heard, just as her father, urged by his success up to the very enthusiasm of perfect acting, stretched out his hands right and left to receive the offered tracts with a smile which many besides Patty might have found it difficult to withstand. The effect of this sudden explosion was startling, and might have been fatal, but for the admirable presence of mind of the major. No instant was lost by him in doubting what the sound might be, or what the cause of it, nor did it take him longer to decide how this alarming contretemps should be met. The effect of this tremendous burst of merriment was not more startling to himself than to those who stood around, each meekly meditating how best to display before the eyes of so holy a gentleman their own particular and individual holiness. As the unexpected sound burst upon their ears, they one and all stood with staring eyes, raised hands, and open mouths, as if they had each been touched by an enchanter's hand, and were rapidly passing from flesh and blood to stone. " Oh my ! What's that? " cried Miss Vanderpuff, actually trembling from head to foot. " Oh dear !" groaned Miss Tomkins. " It is right down awful to hear it ; for as sure as the sun is in heaven, it is neither more nor less than somebody just laughing at us." " And if it is, Mrs. Tomkins," observed the stately Mrs. General Pedmington, with a withering frown, " what is that to us? Are we still so unworthy of our election as to tremble before the idiot roar of a scoffer? "" But, ma'am, 'tis the very lady he brought down," screamed another sister, whose eye, following the direction of the sound, caught sight of the unlucky Patty's showy dress, peeping from behind the curtain of one of the little beds in which she had endeavoured to hide herself. " Possible? " cried another, looking at the major with an altered eye, and appearing to shudder as if seized with an ague fit. " Possible !" screamed a third. " Possible !" echoed a fourth. Alas, poor major! How stood he the while? In reply to this but too intelligible demand as to the possibility of his being in any way connected with this irreverent laughter, he looked around him with an eye expressive of such profound melancholy, that ere he had spoken a single word in his own defence, his cause was already half gained. But he did not do his tongue such injustice as to trust only to his eye, although that expressive organ was again called upon to aid him ere he spoke, for, drawing a white handkerchief from his pocket, he pressed it to the upper part of his face, and by a slightly convulsive movement about the shoulders, might be supposed for several minutes to be weeping bitterly. No men in the world weep so much as the itinerant preachers of America ; and this yielding to the weakness in their military disciple was a fine trait of acute observation. Having recovered himself, however, from this first paroxysm of emotion, he said, " Pity me, my friends ; pity the misery of an unhappy father, whose only child has made herself the wife of a Catholic, and then poisoned the dreadful shaft thus hurled at the very tenderest point of his heart, by giving way to ribald merriment, such as you have just listened to whenever she hears the voice of evangelical holiness from any one. Oh, what are the tortures of that inquisition which her new faith teaches her to venerate, compared to what she now inflicts upon me? It is perfectly impossible to conceive a more touching scene than that which followed this confidential avowal. The 5 sisters of the Needle Steeple congregation, with the distinguished Mrs. General Pedmington at their head, vied with each other in demonstrating the tender commiseration to which this disclosure had given birth. Sighs, groans, broken sentences, and copious tears, all bore witness to their amiable feelings. " And your lady, sir? " said Mrs. General Pedmington, making a gulping effort to overcome her emotion, and speak distinctly. " Your lady? How does she conduct herself in this trying case? "" Alas, madam, alas ! I have no comfort there," was the melancholy reply. "She is within hearing, ma'am, though she has crept into yonder bed, and affects to be sleeping, but however much I may suffer for it afterwards, I will not shrink from avowing to such ears as yours the terrible fate that has fallen upon me. Alas ! I am a lonely and most desolate man, having a wife, yet no wife ; having a daughter, and yet being worse than childless. Dear excellent ladies, I have now opened my whole heart to you, and the comfort of it is great, for I know you will pity me." Peculiarly affectionate and endearing as are the manners and feelings of such ladies as the sisters of the Needle Steeple congregation to all persons belonging to their sect, it is a fact, exceedingly obvious to an accurate observer, that no instances of worldly misfortune elicit so much ardent compassion and sympathy among them as matrimonial differences of opinion. This peculiar species of charity was particularly evident on the present occasion, though each of the pitying ladies, as she threw a heart-broken sort of glance on the unfortunate gentleman, felt determined to check all verbal expression of her feelings for the present, in consequence of the close proximity of his uncongenial wife. This feeling, indeed, was so general among them that the only words uttered audibly were from the lips of Mrs. General Pedmington, and merely consisted of this cautious phrase: "At a future opportunity, sir, I trust we may meet again." At this moment the stewardess entered, and the solitary lady passenger, who, as related above, had not joined in making the major free of the cabin, addressed her with some asperity, saying, "If you knew your business, mistress, I expect I should not be kept out of my berth, when I want to get into it, by having the ladies' cabin turned into a chapel. If you won't turn that male passenger out, I must go and find the captain, that's all." It will readily be believed that the intrusion of Major Allen Barnaby into the ladies' cabin did not continue long after this hint. He just paused to give one circular glance of grateful acknowledgment to the fair friends he left there, and then sprang up the narrow stairs with the activity of 15. When the passengers were disembarking on the following morning, the major took care to be on the gangway for the purpose of offering his hand to the ladies of the Needle Steeple congregation as they stepped across the plank; a civility which was graciously received by them all, and in the case of Mrs. General Pedmington rewarded by a whispered renewal of the invitation to Mount Lebanon. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of The Barnabys in America by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43. The ladies of Sandusky do the honours of their town to the Major. He profits thereby like an extremely wise man. He is rewarded for this by a happy reunion with his family at Pittsburgh. The narrative returns to Mr. Egerton, and records some interesting anecdotes concerning him. On reaching the first good-looking hotel near the landing place, the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough entered it, and immediately ordered the best rooms they had, especially mentioning, with much solemnity, the necessity of a quiet and undisturbed sitting-room. "In course, sir," replied the landlady, for luckily for the Major it was a landlady and not a landlord to whom he had addressed himself. "In course, sir, I know my duty to a gentleman such as you too well, not to take care of that." And sure enough, the landlady did show them into a particular snug and quiet room, at the greatest possible distance from the noisy bar, and with so long a passage leading to it that it really seemed as if it had been built on purpose for seclusion. Having entered this room sedately, one by one, closed the door, and listened for a minute to the briskly retreating steps of the busy landlady, the Major, his wife, and daughter, simultaneously threw themselves into 3 chairs, and forthwith indulged in such an unmitigated peal of laughter as to make the startled and perplexed Tornorino look as if he thought they were all seized with a sudden fit of insanity. Nor did the observing this either induce or enable them to moderate their mirth, but perhaps had rather a contrary effect. And no wonder, for it is impossible to conceive a much more ludicrous contrast than that offered by the grave and weary-looking Don and his laughter-shaken companions. At length, however, the convulsion passed, and then, amidst the mutual compliments which were exchanged upon the perfect performance of the gentleman, the admirably discreet forbearance of his wife, together with a few gentle reproaches to Patty upon her dangerous want of self-control, the mystery was explained, and Tornorino made to understand all that had happened. Another gay supper followed this triumphant recital of the clever scene, when it was agreed on all sides that with such an admirable talent, and such brilliant success in the use of it, the Major owed it to himself and his family to turn it to greater profit than merely throwing dust enough in the eyes of Mr. Gabriel Monkton to puzzle him as to his identity. "Upon my honour, Donny, you must make these ladies pay for your preaching, or I shall not be satisfied," said my heroine. The Major looked roguishly at her in return, and said, "I am not sure, my Barnaby, that you may be perfectly right as to the possibility of my making these exemplary females contribute a few dollars to the expenses of this particularly pleasant journey. But before you set me upon it, dear wife, let me beg you to remember that a good deal of sisterly and brotherly love-making must, in all human probability, take place before the result you anticipate can be looked for. Will not your fond heart feel some tender alarms, my dear, during your widowed residence at Pittsburgh, knowing that I am thus employed at Sandusky?" This sally produced a fresh burst of laughter, and Mrs. Allen Barnaby replied in admirable mock heroic. "Unquestionably, my love, I shall pine and I shall languish. Nevertheless, such is my devotion to the common cause, that I will endure it all, rather than risk the loss of a single dollar, or, gracefully suiting the action to the word, forfeit a single drop of this sparkling glass of champagne." It is now absolutely necessary that the narrative should retrograde a little for the purpose of affording the reader a glimpse at some of the other personages introduced in it. And as my only real and legitimate heroine is at this time suspended, as it were, from all action, while awaiting at Pittsburgh the arrival of her husband from Sandusky, the present opportunity is particularly favourable for that purpose. It is to be hoped that the kind and courteous reader remembers the position of affairs at Big Gang Bank at the time the Allen Barnaby party quitted it, and also the scene which followed between our young English friend Egerton and his umwhile hospitable entertainers. The result of this was his immediately leaving the house, but not the neighbourhood; for, as may be likewise remembered, he had, while uttering his farewell to his particular friend Miss Louisa Perkins, contrived to arrange an assignation with her for the evening at the house of Mrs. Clio Whitlaw. Hurried as was the moment in which this arrangement was settled, he had contrived to make the worthy Louisa understand that this evening meeting would not be quite perfect unless the fair Annie were made a part of it. It must certainly have been owing to the experience which the elder Miss Perkins had gained in love matters by having been a looker-on upon the great variety of such affairs in which the heart of her sister had been concerned, that she so immediately comprehended the state of the case respecting Annie Beauchamp and Mr. Egerton. Most certain it is that they neither of them had ever breathed to her a single syllable explanatory of the state of their respective hearts, and yet the worthy spinster felt as certain of their being exceedingly in love with each other, as if she had been the confidant of both from the first hour of their acquaintance to the last. In this respect, indeed, she had greatly the advantage of them, for although each by this time had a pretty tolerably clear idea of the truth respecting his or her own particular heart, they neither of them dared to believe that he or she had made any impression on the heart of the other. But although Miss Louisa felt as sure could be, that the attachment was equal and mutual, she was not such a blundering agent as to hint this belief to her young friend when she proposed to her the walk to Portico Lodge. She did not, indeed, even mention the name of Mr. Egerton, and whether Miss Beauchamp had overheard any part of the whisper by which the arrangement was made it was impossible for Miss Louisa to guess, for the subject was never even alluded to between them. But however this may be, the young lady made no objection to the proposal of the elder one, and they set off arm in arm together, leaving the colonel and his wife expatiating to Miss Matilda upon the extraordinary virtue and talent of Mrs. Allen Barnaby, and the scandalous conduct of their young countryman, Mr. Egerton. The two walking ladies were, perhaps, about equally well pleased to escape hearing this, and the satisfaction of having done so brought a smile to the melancholy face of poor Annie, but it quickly passed away, for her heart was heavy and sad, and she moved on in total silence, feeling that if her very life had depended upon her talking, it would have been impossible. The good Louisa, however, seemed to understand all about it, and walked on beside her without uttering a sound that might interrupt her pretty companion's reverie. Having thus reached in silence the entrance of Mrs. Whitlaw's domain, Miss Louisa stopped and looked about her. Annie coloured violently, but she stopped also, but it was only for an instant, for as if some thought had arisen in her mind leading her to disapprove this delay, she suddenly moved forward again, and with a much quicker step than before. But ere she reached the little gate through which they were to pass into Mrs. Whitlaw's shrubbery, Frederick Egerton stood before them. Annie Beauchamp did not faint, although she became as pale as alabaster, and so strongly agitated was the young man also, that till Miss Perkins broke the silence, not a word was spoken. She did not, however, watch their embarrassment long without doing her very best, good soul, to remove it. "I see how it is, my dear young friends," she said, "as plainly as if I was in both your hearts. What has happened this morning is certainly very unlucky for you both, but if I leave you by yourselves to talk it over, I hope and trust you will think upon something or other to set it all right again." Egerton gave one look of gratitude to his kind ally, who instantly stepped forward, and then, seizing the hand of Annie, he hastily exclaimed, "Forgive this most involuntary abruptness, dearest Miss Beauchamp. Drive me not from you, as I was driven from your house this morning, but believe that if my respect, my reverence, equalled not my love, I should not thus implore you to be my wife in the only moment and in the only manner that is left me." There was something, it is impossible to describe what, in the eyes of Annie as she raised them to the face of Egerton as he spoke, that seemed to save him from despair, though her first act, except looking at him, was to withdraw her hand, and her first words to say, "If indeed you thus love me, Mr. Egerton, you will instantly overtake Miss Perkins and bring her back to me." It is possible that some young ladies might have spoken such words under similar circumstances, without either intending or expecting that they would or should be obeyed. But there is an intonation in the accents of truth, which when heard by ears intent upon discovering the exact meaning of what they listen to, cannot easily be misunderstood. Egerton had left the side of his beloved, and had taken the hand of Miss Perkins, in order to make her break in upon the tete-a-tete, which he would have given years of life to prolong in less time, perhaps, than it had ever taken him before to bound over an equal space. "She will not listen to me, my dearest Miss Perkins," said he, "unless you are beside her. Come back with me this moment, I entreat you." The kind-hearted Louisa did not get over the ground with precisely the same sort of flying movement that Mr. Egerton had done, but she moved as rapidly as she could towards her young friend. And though in the interpretation of her feelings she had not now the advantage of any great experience from having watched similar emotions in her sister, she seemed somehow or other to comprehend that it was possible, under the peculiar circumstances of the case, that poor Annie might be in earnest in wishing to have her back again. When the trio were thus once more reunited, Annie Beauchamp attempted to say something which doubtless would have been very much to the purpose, but she failed, and instead of speaking, dropped her head upon the shoulder of Louisa and burst into tears. "Poor dear child!" exclaimed the gentle spinster. "She was greatly shocked, Mr. Egerton, by what took place this morning, as I dare say you can guess, sir, pretty well, and therefore you know she must not be hurried now." "Hurried!" cried Egerton, clasping his hands and fixing his eyes upon the weeping girl, with an air and manner that seemed to say he could be contented to stand thus gazing upon her for ages. "Oh no, she shall not be hurried, Miss Perkins. Let her but give me hope for the future, however distant, and she shall see how absolute her power is over me." Annie raised her head and fixed her beautiful eyes, all tearful as they were, upon him. The first overwhelming transition from doubting, trembling hope, to delicious certainty was over, and the firm but gentle energy of Annie Beauchamp immediately displayed itself. "Not for a knowledge of my sentiment shall you wait, Mr. Egerton," said she. "I have been somewhat over-prompt, it may be, in days past, to make you fully comprehend the extent of my prejudices, and I will not be afraid to let you see, that strong as they were not so inveterate as to stand against truth, honour, and generosity. I know nothing of your family or fortune, but I know you, and thus far will I profit by my American freedom. I will promise you, Mr. Egerton, never to be the wife of any other man, so long as it shall continue to be your wish that I should become yours. Nay, nay, you must not thank me thus vehemently," she added, as he seized her hand and covered it with kisses. "For it may be that all I have said, and all I have the power to say, shall mean nothing more than the expression of my gratitude for sentiments so dearly valued, that were my mother and father willing, I would not deem my whole life too long a space to be employed in proving how very precious they are to me. But alas, Mr. Egerton, how can we hope, after what has passed this morning, that I can never be your wife without ceasing to be their child? And this, at once and forever, let me declare to you, I never will do. I will not give you as a companion for life a guilty daughter, whose remorse would grow more bitter every day she lived. This I will never do." "Nor will I ever ask it of you, Annie," replied Egerton, with sincerity equal to her own. "I could not love you as I do, did I not in my very soul believe that you are as good as you are beautiful. But, dearest, I do not despair of obtaining the consent of Colonel Beauchamp, and even of your mother, Annie, angry as she is with me at this moment. I have romance enough about me, I confess, to rejoice at having heard the precious words you have uttered, while you were still ignorant of my fortune and position in the world, and as those dear words are recorded where they will endure as long as life and memory are lent me, I may now tell you freely that my estate, and the settlement I shall propose to your father, are not such as to offer a reason for his rejecting me. My family is honourable and very nobly connected, and what I think will weigh far more with you, dearest Annie, than either I flatter myself I can refer with honest confidence to the guardians who have had charge of me from the death of my father to the time of my coming of age, as well as to Eton and Oxford, where I received my education, for testimony that my actions have hitherto brought no disgrace upon my name." "Ah, Mr. Egerton," returned Annie, with both a sigh and a smile, "all this would have gone very far yesterday towards obtaining such an answer as you wish. But I fear that as yet you have no idea of the anger conceived against you, both for your unfortunate parley with the slaves in the rice grounds, and your accusations against the husband of that terrible Mrs. Barnaby. Indeed, I fear that you would not be listened to upon such a subject for a single instant." "Neither will I venture to ask it, dearest Annie," he replied. "I feel perfectly certain of being able to bring evidence of the truth of all I have said respecting this major, and if I do so, my motives for having warned your father of his practices must surely be justly appreciated. And as to the other offence imputed to me, a very short time must surely suffice to prove that I have at least done nothing productive of any mischievous result." "You speak so hopefully, Mr. Egerton," she replied, "that you make me think you must know better about it all than I do. But you will allow that time must be given, both for your inquiry about the major and for the negative proof of your innocence respecting the poor slaves. But this last imputation will, I doubt not, die away if they all remain quiet." "And time shall be patiently given by me, sweet Annie, provided you promise that I may now and then hear from you. Of course I shall leave this place to-night, as it certainly would look like plotting and planning mischief were I to be found lurking here after the scene of this morning. How I bless the speaking paleness of your fair face, dearest, which gave me the courage to ask our kind friend here for this interview. How different will be my departure now from what in that first dreadful moment I feared it would have been. And you will write to me, Annie? First addressed to the post office at New York, for it is thither, as I understand, that my precious countryman has taken himself, and it is thither that I shall immediately follow. But you will write to me, and promise to receive my letters in return." Annie looked in the face of Miss Perkins, and would at that moment have given a good deal if the kind feeling she so plainly saw written there had been more mingled with the tougher quality of good sense. Poor girl! She longed for an English opinion that might have been trusted, as to the propriety of complying with the request of Egerton. To refuse him seemed almost beyond her strength; yet, conscious of her total ignorance of English etiquette in such matters, she shrunk from the idea of consenting to do what was unusual. Egerton saw the struggle, and understood it. "Are you not my affianced wife, Annie? Conditionally, it is true, but still you are pledged to me. And am I not, still more, your affianced husband? For I have offered my vows unshackled by any condition whatever. Think you, then, that I would ask you to do anything that I would not sanction in my own sister, were I happy enough to have one?" "I will write to you," said Annie gently, "if you desire me to do it." "And will you receive my letters, dearest?" he rejoined, after once again fervently kissing her hand. "Yes, Mr. Egerton, I will," she replied, with something almost approaching to solemnity in her manner. "But in both cases it must be done by the assistance of Miss Perkins, for it must not be from me that my parents first learn what has passed between us." It will easily be believed that the good Louisa raised no difficulties upon this point, and Frederick Egerton looked quite as happy as it was possible for a man to do who was on the very eve of parting with his beloved. All this had passed in a shady and obscure retreat in a rustic summer house at no great distance from the entrance to Mrs. Whitlaw's grounds, into which Annie, who knew it well, had almost unconsciously entered immediately after Miss Perkins had rejoined her. And now she rose to leave it, saying to that excellent person as she did so, "I cannot visit Mrs. Whitlaw now, Miss Louisa. I should not comprehend a single word she said to me. Farewell, Mr. Egerton," and she held out her hand to him. "Farewell." Before this sad word was uttered between them for the last time, the eyes of the whole party bore witness that they did not separate with indifference, for on seeing the emotion of her young friends, the tender-hearted Louisa wept for company. But part they must, and part they did at last; but not till the lovers had confessed to each other that despite the obstacles which thus drove them asunder, that hour was the happiest of their lives. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of The Barnabys in America by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 44. The Major's versatile powers are shewn to great advantage. Patty displays an affectionate heart. Mr. Egerton takes a very long journey to very little purpose, but comes to a safe harbour at last. So very little space is left for detailing the last scenes of the Barnabys in America, that they must needs be passed over very lightly. It is hardly necessary, after what the reader knows already, to state that the reception of the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough at Mount Lebanon was everything his heart could wish. Young ladies and old, brown ladies and fair, all vied with each other how they best might prove their reverence for his character and admiration for his talents. It is true that the gentlemen of Sandusky did not put themselves to much trouble to do the honours of the town to the industrious Major; but neither did they, on the other hand, at all interfere to check the hospitalities of the ladies, so that the time he remained there he might truly be said to have been living in clover. It must be remembered, however, that Major Allen Barnaby, though for particular reasons alone at Sandusky, was not alone in the world. At any rate, he himself never forgot that he had a wife and daughter, whose worldly welfare depended as much upon his exertions in one way, as the unworldly welfare of the serious ladies of the lake did in another. And it therefore happened, as all persons blessed with an acute perception of character must have foreseen, that he had not remained many days amongst them before he made it understood that the hand of fortune had been as penurious to him as that of nature had been bountiful. Were this chapter of his adventures at the beginning of the first volume instead of being at the end of the third, I might be tempted to describe at some length the various ways in which his conjugal and paternal affections acted as siphons upon the female pockets of this amiable inland sea population. But the time is past for this, and I must therefore content myself with stating that for nearly a month the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough lived upon the fattest fat of the Sandusky land, and that seldom a day passed during this period without adding $1 or two on some pretence or other to his resources. The liberality of Mrs. General Pedmington, indeed, was not restrained to such little offerings as these, for ere he parted she presented her new friend with $500 for the embellishment of his humble chapel in England, upon condition, affectionately expressed and fully understood, that he should revisit Mount Lebanon before his departure for the old country. It was not, perhaps, the least agreeable feature of this delightful month, that the Major during the course of it had the singular gratification of hearing himself perpetually talked of, described, and condemned to all sorts of pains and penalties as one of the most audacious swindlers that ever ventured to poach on the native preserves of the Union, while he sat tranquilly by, uttering an occasional "alas" at the strange depravity of human nature. At length, however, some feelings of weariness began to creep, like a mildew, over the delights of the Mount Lebanon reunions. Not indeed among the charming society to its manners born, but to the stranger, who had first to learn their ways and then to adopt them. It was amidst showers of tears that the sisters of the Needle Steeple congregation took their last reluctant leave of the gentle Major, and the judicious tenderness with which he graduated his farewell benedictions to them all, had in it a delicacy of tact that upon recollection positively surprised himself, and caused him to exclaim, as so many have done before him, "No man knows what he is capable of performing till he tries." Can it be doubted that the meeting with his family at Pittsburgh was delightful? Or that Mrs. Allen Barnaby was rewarded with more than one glass of her favourite wine, for having so long and so patiently endured the absence of her beloved husband? And at Pittsburgh, as before decided, they took into consideration the comparative advantages of risking returning for a few days to New Orleans or its neighbourhood, which could be done with perfect convenience by water, or of travelling across the Allegheny Mountains to Baltimore for the purpose of embarking for Europe. Against the first, there was the danger of the Major's being recognized as the hero of the big gang bank festivities. Against the last, was the expense and fatigue of a long land journey, with the doubt whether the Major would be much safer there than at New Orleans. Patty, whose fears from discovery were of a considerably graver nature than those of the rest of the party, protested strongly against returning to New Orleans, declaring that though Pap did sometimes put her in dreadful passions by being so stingy of his money to her and the Don, she did not want to have him hanged. Few ladies, on the whole, could be less victims of delicate sensibility than my beautiful bride, Yet, nevertheless, she now exhibited considerable feeling, for upon her mother saying that she thought they would be all safe at New Orleans if they did but take a little care, and put up at the further end of the town for Mrs. Carmichael's boarding house, she burst out upon her with great vehemence, and declared that she believed in her heart that she was looking forward to being a widow again, and making conquests. The Major was a good deal touched by this testimony of his daughter's affection, but being himself very strongly in favour of the New Orleans scheme, he told her, after a hearty hug, that he was excessively obliged to her for her kindness, and that the fear of vexing her if anything went wrong with him, would be as likely to make him careful as the dread of the gallows itself. "But if you could have seen me at Mount Lebanon, my darling, you would have been cured at once and for ever of all fears on my account. I really did not know my own powers before, Patty, but now I declare to you upon my word and honour, I would rather have the fun of bamboozling the natives than not. I would venture to bet 5,000 to 1 against any one of those we saw at New Orleans knowing me again, if I did not choose they should do so. Besides, my dear, I have another word to say in favour of the New Orleans plan. I heard from many people while I was at Sandusky that it would be a sin and a shame to leave the country without spending a few weeks at Natchez, which for pleasant amusements and all that," and here the Major gave a sidelong glance of intelligence to his wife and the Don, "is quite New Orleans in miniature. And moreover, by reposing ourselves there for a little while, it would be easy enough to leave when there was a good vessel going to start for Havre, and our places might be easily secured on board her without our ever making our appearance in the city till the very day she set off. I vote, therefore, for our making our way by the Ohio and the Mississippi to Natchez, and remaining exactly as long as we find it agreeable, and not an hour longer." This scheme seemed to satisfy all parties, and was accordingly acted upon forthwith. The long river voyage was performed with much less tediousness than any of them expected, for the Major and his son-in-law scarcely ever passed an idle hour while they were on board, nor one that was not more or less profitable, for this long line of river travelling is as remarkable for its industrious gambling as for any other of its agreeable features. As to Mrs. Allen Barnaby and Patty, they found means to amuse themselves exceedingly well, though they played neither at whist nor piquet. There were several ladies on board, who by asking them, day after day, incessant questions respecting themselves, gave them both such an opportunity of vapouring about their European grandeur as kept them in perpetual good humour, so that they all arrived at Natchez in excellent spirits, and ready to meet whatever adventures might chance to befall them there with sharp wits and sturdy courage. It took but little time to convince Major Allen Barnaby that the information he had received respecting the social and intellectual advancement of the population of this flourishing little town was perfectly correct. It realized all his hopes and exceeded all his expectations, so that for rather more than 2 months that the party remained, he had scarcely a single misadventure or disappointment of any kind to recount to his faithful wife. This steady current of good fortune, however, only served in the long run to convince him that with his talents and advantages, his son-in-law ranking higher and higher every day among the latter, he could not do himself justice while carrying on business in so small a way. His high-minded wife also was most decidedly of the same opinion, and being moreover, as well as her daughter, heartily tired of the town and everything in it, the feminine influence of the family was put forth with considerable activity, while even the peaceable Tornorino, though exceedingly well pleased by a few well-timed donations from his father-in-law, began to hint now and then in a gentle murmur that "the vin was not ver good." In a word, their speedy departure was fixed and decided upon a certain evening when little or nothing had been done at the usual place of meeting; and on the following morning the Major started alone for New Orleans by an early steamboat, intending to disembark a mile or two above the town, and to proceed early on the following morning direct to the Keys, where the large vessels bound to Europe were sure to be found. The costume he assumed for this expedition was that of the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough, over which, on leaving his lodging, he threw a large cloak to prevent any observations from his neighbours, and quietly walked on board, in all outward respects so utterly unlike the military gentleman who had figured as an East Indian of a large fortune, during his residence at Natchez, that there was certainly very little chance of his being recognised. While he is prosperously borne by tide and steam towards the place of his destination, we will rapidly follow the fortunes of Mr. Egerton from the time he left the side of Annie Beauchamp in pursuit of him. In the first instance he proceeded, in consequence of the information he had received, to New York, and devoted himself most indefatigably to the task of discovering if any such personage as Major Allen Barnaby was to be found there. Not a single hotel, boarding, or lodging-house of tolerable respectability was left unquestioned, and such was the zeal and perseverance of his perquisition, that had the Major been in the city he could scarcely have escaped it. But during the days thus employed, our Major and his family were, as the reader well knows, at Philadelphia. Being at length reluctantly convinced that no Major Allen Barnaby was to be found there, Mr. Egerton returned to New Orleans, convinced that he had begun his search very unadvisedly in taking it for granted that his slippery countryman was likely to be found where he said he should be, and determined for the future to trace him step by step on surer evidence than his own word. He ventured not, however, to present himself at Big Gang Bank, but obtained from his fair correspondent there all the particulars she could gather from the slaves who had attended upon the Allen Barnaby party, as to the place to which they had conducted them. To this place he immediately repaired, but though the party as described by him were perfectly well remembered at the principal hotel there, he found it impossible to ascertain with certainty whither they went afterwards. Most of the people of the house declaring that they went to New York, while one or two porters positively stated that their luggage was put on board a vessel going to Philadelphia. In this dilemma, the young man had recourse to his own judgment as to which was most probable, and although he had already satisfactorily convinced himself that, in the first instance, he certainly did not go to New York, he still thought his chance of finding him would be better if he again returned to that city, in the hope of his having visited it subsequently, than waste his time in troubling by going to Philadelphia, knowing enough of the style of its society to be convinced that if the object of his search had really been there he did not stay long. To New York, therefore, he again repaired, but not till Major Allen Barnaby had left it about 24 hours. But though he found not him, he found enough concerning him to add proof to conviction as to his character. For here chance favoured him, by sending him upon his arrival to the same house in which the illustrious English family had boarded, and his very first inquiry brought forth from the party at the dinner table where it was made, the most violent burst of indignation against the Major, who was declared by the whole company to be the most atrocious swindler that ever lived. Beyond this, however, he gained little information sufficiently authentic to be of any use to him. He had been traced to the Springs, they said, and clearly recognized as the suspicious individual to whom Mr. Gabriel Monkton had devoted so much attention. But beyond the deck of the steamboat all trace of him was lost, and that how, when, and where he got on shore no one knew, or, notwithstanding the national propensity, could even venture to guess. Mr. Monkton had declared that he had himself watched every passenger that had left the boat, both at Cleveland and at Sandusky, and that Major Allen Barnaby was most certainly not amongst them. It was, however, the general opinion of the whole party that he had escaped the very active pursuit after him, by travelling pretty considerable far west, such being, as they said, the universal custom of all the gentry who had made the old states too hot to hold them. The evident probability that this was the fact was a severe disappointment to poor Egerton, who had hoped to return to the house of Colonel Beauchamp with such confirmation of his statement respecting the Major, as might have restored the confidence and friendly feeling of himself and wife in greatly less time than it would take him to reach the Far West, and obtain such legal confirmation of what he had asserted as could admit of no contradiction or evasion. The news he had of the runaway at New York was, however, such as very satisfactorily to strengthen his hopes of obtaining this could he overtake him, and he therefore once more set forth, with no other guide than what was furnished by a list of the various towns through which he was likely to pass, or where he might have been tempted to tarry. This very laborious expedition, however, proved entirely abortive, and at length, weary and desponding, he gave up the chase, and determined upon returning with all speed to New Orleans, where Annie's letters informed him the family would soon be settled for the winter, with no better proof of what he had stated than the reports he had heard at New York. Harassed and out of spirits, Egerton was traversing the galley walk of the steamboat that was taking him his last day's voyage towards the place of his destination, when the boat stopped to take in wood and passengers at Natchez. The young man was in no very speculative humour, and though he listlessly bent over the rail as if to watch the comers and goers, he in reality paid but little attention to any of them. There was one figure, however, which, notwithstanding his abstraction, drew his attention and fixed it. This was a peculiarly nice-looking elderly gentleman, dressed in black, whose sole dress and aspect declared him to be of the clerical profession, and whose remarkable quietness of demeanour offered a strong contrast to the half-horse, half-alligator population, of which the passengers were almost entirely composed. This venerable personage entered the vessel and moved onward without looking either to the right or to the left, and in doing so, passed so close to Mr. Egerton, but without seeing him. The profile of this respectable gentleman struck Egerton as being very like that of some individual whom he had seen, he knew not where or when, and he followed him with the sort of curiosity which this imperfect kind of recollection always produces. When the stranger reached the gallery in front of the great cabin, he seated himself for a moment on a sofa that was placed there, and with his hands rather formally crossed upon his breast, lifted his mild eyes and looked about him. In this circular glance he caught sight of Mr. Egerton, and in doing so started evidently, at least to the young man himself, whose eye was fixed upon him, but not sufficiently to attract the attention of any other person. This involuntary movement on the part of the respectable gentleman in black naturally attracted a more scrutinizing glance from Egerton in return, and then, though the reverend personage was moving away, and that a portion only of his face was visible, he instantly became convinced that he saw before him the man he was seeking. His own mode of proceeding was immediately decided on. The start and the sudden departure showed him both that he was recognized and avoided, and he determined, while strictly keeping watch over him, that he would show no symptom of recollecting their having met before. At the dinner table, the black-coated gentleman took his place with the rest of the company, but Egerton, while taking care to look around him with an equal air of indifference upon them all, was aware that his looks, words, and gestures were carefully watched by the stranger. He felt certain if his ci devant acquaintance perceived that he was known in spite of his disguise, he would bolt at the first station at which the boat should stop to take in wood for the engine. But so well did he contrive to look at the man as if he had never seen him before, that our major, for most surely it was himself, became perfectly reassured, and fully confirmed in the agreeable conviction that when he chose to disguise himself, nobody could find him out. The Reverend Mr. O'Donagough, therefore, it was thus that his carpet-bag was labelled, continued his voyage to New Orleans, with no further precaution than taking care not to speak within hearing of Mr. Egerton, lest his ear might prove more discerning than his eye. It was as dark as an American night could well be when they reached New Orleans, and Egerton, aware that it would be impossible to watch his suspicious fellow traveller without following him too closely, to avoid being watched in his turn, very cleverly enlisted in his service a negro lad who had charge of a neatly ornamented birdcage, containing a fine mocking-bird, to whom during many hours of the day he had been teaching various tunes. This rather amusing occupation first caused Mr. Egerton to notice him, and the sable youth giving sundry indications of sharp-wittedness in his answers, it struck him that $1 might be well bestowed in securing his services as a spy. The offer was promptly made and promptly accepted. The Reverend Mr. O'Donagough paid no attention whatever to the young slave and his bird-cage, who, having seen the parson gentleman's safely house at an obscure inn, returned swiftly to his employer, who was awaiting him at a well-known hotel near the landing-place. The diligence and intelligence of the lad induced Egerton to inquire if he could serve him further, and he was readily answered in the affirmative, the young slave stating that he was the property of a pretty young lady, who was very good-natured and would not scold him even if he did stay out of the house a bit now and then. No arrangement could be more favourable for his purpose, as no agent could be employed less likely to excite suspicion; and accordingly, having paid him in a style very effectually to answer his zealous services, he made the youth understand enough of his object to render them available, and then repaired to the post-office, where, according to promise, he found a letter from Annie. She told him that their removal to New Orleans was postponed, in consequence of some plantation business, which was to be completed before they left the premises, but that she thought he might venture to pay them a visit, if he wished it, as both her father and mother had first become affronted, and then suspicious, in consequence of never having received a single line from their dear friend Mrs. Allen Barnaby, from the time she had left them. Moreover, their far-off neighbour Mr. Hapford, having at length recovered from a violent fit of the gout, had been at the bank and declared his conviction of having been cheated at play by the whiskered Englishman whom he had met there at his last visit. All this, as Annie gently observed, would greatly lessen the probability of his being rudely received if he came to visit them. His fair correspondent then went on to say that she thought poor Louisa Perkins, to whom he had always shown so much kindness, was greatly in want of some friend to put her in the way of getting back to England, for that though she and her sister were come again to the bank, after making a circle of visits among the people who most wished to honour Mrs. Allen Barnaby, it was very evident that her father and mother wanted to get rid of them, and Annie said she greatly feared they would not much longer delay letting them perceive this, in a manner that it would greatly pain her to witness. This long letter was read twice through, and then Egerton, having kissed the signature, folded the precious paper carefully, and placed it, like its rather numerous predecessors, under the protection of a Bramah lock, began to meditate upon the difficult problem of how he could set off instantly to obey the summons it contained, yet not lose sight of the Major before he could learn a little more concerning him. That of these two apparently incompatible objects, the first was in his estimation the most important, was proved by his instantly ringing for a waiter, and dispatching him to secure a place in the next coach that left New Orleans in the direction he wished to go. No such conveyance, however, was to depart till the following morning, and before he went to rest, his black ally inquired for him, and was shown into his room. His report was as follows. The parson gentleman was called the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough. He was going to Havre. Wanted 4 first-rate berths, and his family at Natchez, should go and fetch them in time to sail. The Lady Anne, which was the name of the vessel in which he was going, was not to sail for 10 days. And finally, the reverend gentleman himself had already started off again in a steamboat for Natchez. It was impossible any intelligence could be more agreeable. If Colonel Beauchamp still wished for any further information respecting his late honoured guests, there was time enough for the purpose before they sailed, and moreover their young accuser would have the satisfaction of conveying the important intelligence that they had again thought it convenient to change their name. Egerton slept soundly, though dreaming all night of Annie, and arrived without delay or accident of any kind within half an hour's walk of Big Gang Bank. It was long since Frederick Egerton had experienced emotions of so much happiness as at the moment he set off upon this walk. The letter of Annie had, perhaps, more of shyness and less of love than any of her former ones, but he interpreted this very correctly, and was certainly not the less happy for it. Annie fancies, thought he, that I am already almost in her presence, and must not be spoilt by too much indulgence. Thus gaily thinking, he went bounding on, and had reached the palings that surround Mrs. Whitlaw's property, which, ardently as he wished to advance with all possible speed, almost induced him to stop that he might gaze upon the objects which had surrounded him when Annie had first promised that she would never be the wife of another. But the question whether he should pause or not was not left for him to decide, for just as he reached the little gate by which he had formerly entered the premises, Nina, the favourite slave of his beloved, rushed out and seized his arm. "Thank God, Mr. Egerton," she exclaimed, "I have not watched for you in vain. My mistress is here, Miss Annie is here. Come in, come in. You must not go a single step farther towards the bank." Delighted to find that Annie was so near, and thinking perhaps that she had come thither, and set her favourite to watch for him, that she might give him some word of advice or instruction before he saw her parents, Egerton followed the rapidly retreating figure of Nina, till he once more found himself in the flowery portico of the good Clio's elegant abode. Notwithstanding the advanced season, the windows were open, and another step placed him before the eyes of Annie Beauchamp. Though the slave Nina had so evidently expected him, it was equally plain that her young mistress did not, for the agitation of Annie was for a moment too great to permit her speaking. But tears of emotion were blended with smiles of happiness as she yielded her beautiful hand to his caresses almost without a struggle. When at length she found her voice, she exclaimed, "How can it be that I see you here, Mr. Egerton? I confess I have been hoping for your arrival at the bank for 2 days past, but what has made you come here? Have you seen my father?" "I am right down glad he is here, Annie," interrupted Mrs. Whitlaw, cordially offering her hand to Egerton. "I saw how it was going on with his heart when he was here before. And what could he do better, Annie, than come here to meet you, and tell you all about it? Perhaps, you know, my dear, he may not be that much at his ease with Madame Beauchamp and the Colonel as he might be with you and I." Egerton related his meeting with Nina at the gate, and whispered to Annie that she confessed she was waiting for him. "Silly girl!" exclaimed the young lady, blushing. "I dare say she knew that I was expecting you, but most surely I never told her to waylay you in this strange style, Mr. Egerton." "Let not the kind zeal in my service bring reproof on her," he replied, laughing. I shall remember it with gratitude, my Annie, as long as I live." A very interesting conversation then followed, in which Mr. Egerton narrated his discovery of the disguised major on board the steamboat, which Annie assured him would be more than sufficient to convince her father and mother that he was indeed all that they had been so kindly warned to expect they should find him. And then followed a discussion in which Mrs. Whitlaw joined as to the best mode of Mr. Egerton's presenting himself. Should he accompany Annie home? Should Annie precede him, or should he precede her? She declared that she had not courage to announce his approach, and it was at length agreed that he should proceed to the bank alone, endeavour to see both her parents, inform them of all he had learned concerning Major Allen Barnaby, and then venture to ask if they considered this as proof sufficient of his being a man of honour. If the answer was favourable, he was to go on to express all his hopes and ask their consent to his wishes. Having received the sanction of Annie and her affectionate friend for this, he left them, and had already again reached the little gate which opened from the lawn, and which was not within sight of the house, when once more he was met by Nina. He had observed that she looked hurried and agitated when he first met her, but she was now infinitely more so, and when she found from the direction he took, and the words he said, that he was hastening to Colonel Beauchamp's house, she threw herself on the ground before him, and with tears and sobs implored him to go back. No room is left me to describe at length the scene which followed. Finding that nothing she could say could dissuade Egerton from executing the plan which had been sanctioned by Annie, she uttered a groan that made him shudder, and exclaimed, "Then I must break my oath and sacrifice my life for her, and what is dearer to her than herself. If you go to my master's house, young gentleman, you will be murdered." Even after this it was some time before the terrified and reluctant girl could be made to explain herself fully; but at length she confessed, amidst sobs and groans, that the slaves on the colonel's property and that of the neighbouring plantation, which belonged to Judge Johnson, were in revolt, and stood bound by tremendous oath to murder every white person of whatever age or sex that should come across them, while in the act of securing whatever portable property of value they could find in either mansion. They had arranged, she said, to escape to the numberless hiding places known to them in the neighbouring forests, where they could long subsist upon the food they meant to carry with them, and expected finally to get off by means of the money of which they expected to get possession, and because no one would be left alive in either estate to pursue them. To the execution of this wild and horrible project they had all engaged themselves by the most solemn vows, "and rather would they fail and die," cried the girl, "than live to endure more years of misery." Egerton's first object was to restore the agitated Nina to such a degree of composure as might enable her to tell him how long this scene of horror had been in action, and where she imagined her master and mistress to be. At length he learned from her, but not without considerable difficulty, that when the oath was first proposed to her, she refused to take it, but was told that if she persevered in this she would be kidnapped away and kept a close prisoner till it was all over. She then took it, but with the understanding, after long battling for it, that she might save the white females if she could, but that if she attempted to save the life of a white man she would herself be murdered. She told him also that after prevailing on Miss Annie to pay a visit to Mrs. Whitlaw, she had got Mrs. Beauchamp and the Miss Perkinses into the dairy house, under pretence that Miss Annie wanted to show them something there, and that having previously secured the windows she had locked them in, and then ran away. Egerton's first thought after hearing this terrifying statement was concerning the safety of Annie. He told the trembling slave to fear nothing, but carefully to watch her young mistress, and if she attempted to leave her present shelter, to tell Mrs. Whitlaw the whole truth, that she might restrain her even by force if necessary. He then obtained the key of the dairy house, the situation of which he well knew, determined that his first object should be the conveying the ladies confined in it to Mrs. Whitlaw's, and then to trust to being recognised as an Englishman, while he risked a visit to Colonel Beauchamp's house in the faint hope of saving its wretched master. Light of foot, firm in nerve, and steadfast in purpose, he lost no moment after deciding what to do. He found the three ladies in a state of dreadful alarm; for no sooner did Mrs. Beauchamp discover that they were prisoners than she guessed the truth, for by an infatuation difficult to comprehend, the lives of the planters seemed pretty equally divided between tyrannizing over their slaves and trembling at the chance of their taking vengeance for it. Very few words passed between them, Egerton saying in that tone of decision which at such moments is all-powerful, "Mrs. Beauchamp, give me your arm. Follow us closely, Miss Perkins, with your sister. I will take you to a place of safety where you will find Miss Beauchamp, and then I will seek the Colonel." Not a word was uttered in reply. Nothing, I believe, silences talkers effectually but terror and seasickness. It was the wish and will of Egerton that they should walk quickly, but they had no other difficulty to contend with, for the negroes were too busy at their work of pillage to be at many yards' distance from the house. On reaching the friendly abode of the good Clio, they found that Nina, in her restless anxiety, had already told both her and Annie all she had previously told Egerton. The delight of Annie at seeing her mother in safety may be imagined, nor is it needful to dwell upon the amount of her gratitude to Egerton. But dreadful was the combat at her heart when she saw him about to plunge into danger so dreadfully certain in the desperate hope of saving her unhappy father. Yet could she bid him to stay? It was impossible. Fortunately, perhaps for her reason, the interval of suspense was very short. On leaving the house he met one of Mrs. Whitlaw's domestic blacks. Her slaves, though much too well treated, too lazy and too happy to join in the insurrection, were still negroes, and as such most ardently interested in the success of their less happy fellow slaves. The man was returning from the scene of outrage, and seeing Egerton, whom he remembered as an English visitor, hurrying towards it, he civilly stopped him and begged him to return. "Colonel Beauchamp," said the panting Egerton. "He has been dead this hour, sir," returned the negro, casting down his eyes, but very nearly smiling at the same moment. "And Judge Johnson," he added in the same respectful tone, "has been done for longer still." It is needless to dwell on the scenes which followed. Mrs. Whitlaw assured her agitated neighbours that they were now in no danger, but that as their former residence would offer a scene too painful for them to look upon, their best course would be to accept the loan of her carriage and horses, and set off for New Orleans, or perhaps for New York, directly. "For England, dearest Mrs. Beauchamp," exclaimed Egerton. "Accept from me the duty, the affection, the protection of a son, and let me accompany you to England." All that was likely to make this scheme appear desirable to the agitated widow was soon explained to her. The Misses Perkins seemed ready to take upon themselves the duties of the slave she had lost, so they might be permitted to accompany her; and in short, for short it now must be, everything concerning what they left behind was consigned to the management of the friendly and prosperous Clio, and within 24 hours after Egerton's arrival he was on the road back to New Orleans, escorting his Annie, her mother, his 2 countrywomen, and the faithful Nina, to that city. The tide had reached the point at which it is most favourable for vessels to work down the river from New Orleans to the Belize, and Egerton, with the party of females above enumerated, were waiting on the noble wharf for the arrangement of the ladder which was to assist them to get on board. 2 fine vessels were at that moment preparing to depart for Europe, and the part of the wharf near which they both lay was crowded with spectators. In the midst of this crowd was a group less quiet and less sad-looking than their own, and which presently roused their attention by suddenly approaching them. "My dearest Mrs. Beauchamp," exclaimed my bold-hearted heroine, too secure of an immediate retreat to be afraid of anything. "Goodness me, if there isn't the Perkinses!" cried Patty, clapping her hands. "My dear ladies, our ladder is ready," said the major, still enacting the character of the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough, and presenting his arm to his wife. Tornorino performed the same duty to his, and the whole party brushed by Mr. Egerton and his friends, none of whom gave a look or uttered a word of recognition, and mounted with every appearance of glee the lovely Anna, bound for home. The party bound for England were also on board in a few minutes, and the 2 vessels followed each other closely down the river, the navigation of which, though slow, was perfectly prosperous, and Patty amused herself most delightfully during nearly the whole time it lasted by peeping at her old friends through a telescope, and proclaiming their quizzical looks to every one who would listen to her. "The ingratitude of these Perkinses is perfectly disgusting," said Mrs. Allen Barnaby with a shrug. "Heaven knows where they are all bundling to," she added, "but there is one thing you must promise me, my dearest Donny, and it is, that if we ever have the misfortune of falling in with any of that horridly vulgar set on the continent, you will look at one and all of them as if you had never set eyes on them before." End of chapter 44. End of the Barnabys in America by Frances Milton Trollope. Recorded by Celine Major.